This is Hacker Public Radio episode 3329 for Thursday, the 6th of May 2021. Today's show is entitled Linux Inlaws S01E29, the one and only Linux kernel contributor panel, and is part of the series Linux Inlaws. It is hosted by Monochromic and is about 84 minutes long and carries an explicit flag. The summary is an eclectic panel of Linux contributors discuss technology, anger management, and other things.
This episode of HPR is brought to you by archive.org. Support universal access to all knowledge by heading over to archive.org/donate.
This is Linux Inlaws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever else fancies your tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy, Mum? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back on a speaker in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35, or any pets, including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusted guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. This is Season 1, Episode 29. Of something called Linux Inlaws. Martin, how are things?
Oh, I think things are great. We had some aliens land and they wanted to join the show apparently. So
really,
looking forward to that one. So my co-host informed me.
Which I'm a little bit confused about because we have this exclusive round of kernel contributors on a panel talking about, of course, Linux and kernels and stuff.
We do indeed.
So without further ado, sorry aliens, you have to wait. Just simply send a mail to gig@linuxinlaws.eu, or even better, to sponsor at linuxinlaws.eu if you want to sponsor us. And we'll sort you out right away so you can appear on a further future episode. And without further ado, as I said, let's get rolling and welcome the panel. Tonight we have an eclectic panel of kernel contributors around a virtual table, and the idea is basically to shed some light on the on Linux itself as the biggest open source project on the planet. But before we go into the details, why don't we do a short intro round? Dario, why don't you start?
Sure. So hello everyone, I am Dario. I am from Italy and I live in Italy. I currently work for SUSE in the virtualization team, and I guess I'll say that I started doing kernel hacking some 12 years ago, and I was told back then by the benevolent dictator in person that what I was working on was bullshit, but I'm still here. That's it.
Excellent.
Very interesting. Mr. Jörn Engel.
Yeah, I'm, as you might notice by the name, German, currently working and living in the US for 10 years or so. Started kernel hacking, I think around 2000. At the time, I wanted to do some sort of versioning file system. Basically, I wanted version control of the file system, which is a horrible idea, but it got me into kernel hacking and 20 years later, I'm still doing it about half my time.
Wow. Okay. Yes. On to Aurélien. Sorry,
Aurélien.
I botched the name.
Aurélien.
Sorry.
Yes.
Aurélien. Sorry. Yes, we
Yeah,
cut this out.
that's fine. So as the name suggests, maybe for some people, I'm French. I work for SUSE as well, from Nuremberg in Germany. I work on the SMB stack at SUSE, so I maintain the Samba server, and I slowly migrated over the years over to the kernel client to mount remote shares.
Okay. Dave, over to you.
I'm Dave Fenkler, German living in France, retired. Been hacking a kernel since I can't remember. My main mission is to support the test and measurement drivers. So I support the USB TMC driver in the mainstream tree, and then I support a whole bunch of outer tree drivers in the GPIB Linux package.
Okay. Jacopo?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry, I kept dropping off.
No worries.
So it's my time. Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, sorry, but just introduce yourself. Sorry.
Okay. Hi again. I'm Jacopo. I'm Italian. I live in Italy as well, and I'm doing kernel development for like 5 years or so. So I think I'm the newest one here probably. I do mostly work in the multimedia subsystems for camera integration. So I do mostly driver development to the kernel. And I still find it very funny, even if I'm doing some more open user space development recently. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And so, yeah, I'm still enjoying that, and even if it's not been too long. So I also sent my first patch to Greg with Thunderbird, and I was arguing with him that I was right and he was wrong for like 3 or 4 emails, but then I'm still around, so I think it's a good sign.
Okay, thank you. Luke.
Hi, yeah. So, my name's Luke Layden. I actually started on Samba. This was 1995, and I downloaded Slackware 3.1 by walking in unauthorized into the Cambridge Computer Lab and downloading it on 150 floppies. Then I did my first after that reverse engineering that I did, my first actual Linux kernel hacking was the HTC Linux, the Xanadux project, ported, reverse engineered 9 HTC smartphones and got in a row and got the Linux kernel 2.420 something up and running on it, and then later on ported to a Cirrus Logic's 90 megahertz CPU 2. That was to 2.6 graphics went to the 2.6 kernel, so that's about 2003.
So quite a few long-term contributors among the crowd. Excellent. I think the only one that is missing is Carlos, if I'm completely mistaken. But Carlos doesn't seem to be around, so okay, cool.
Yeah, you're right.
Let's start with a little bit of history. Given the fact that Linux has just turned 26, I think. There's a little bit of history about this whole thing. What do you consider the most important achievement over this period of time? And anything goes here. It doesn't have to be technical. Can be license change. Can be that the fact that ARM entered the architecture mix in what was it, 94 or something. Anything goes. The floor is yours.
First off, I think it's 30 years. Linux started in 91.
1991.
Thank you.
Probably the fact that it's running at all as a major contribution to a project of this size.
I mean, I read a piece about a couple of years back that this is the only operating system running right from tiny embedded systems run up to mainframes. So I reckon the architecture choice would come to mind, but again, people may have different views on this.
I would say it was the opposite. For the first 10 years or so of Linux existence, it was largely an x86 PC thing, and there was this NetBSD that was the portable operating system that claimed to be running on 100 different architectures or something like that. And then around 2000 early-ish, I ran the numbers and realized that actually Linux by now ran on more systems than NetBSD. And well, that trajectory hasn't changed. Linux runs on pretty much everything, but it didn't start out with a claim to be this portable operating system. It was very much written for x86. We still have code in the kernel that assumes that the FSGS segment stuff that we inherited from the 386 is still around 30 years later. And
it's gone now.
Oh, it's gone. Okay. So it lived for a long time, and I think it was even used on other architectures, or at least the names were being used for things that were clearly not the same registers. The difference is more a make it work attitude. The first part of Linux happened because someone at DEC decided to send Linus a machine, and Linus then had the spare machine sitting around and got it working. And most parts afterwards were pretty much, okay, we have this extra machine, and let's just copy the x86 or PowerPC or whatever Arch directory and fix all the bugs that where this particular architecture happens to be different from the one we copied. And then
that is very interesting. That is very interesting that you say it's x86 legacy, because from the when device tree hit, that was very, very clear that people didn't understand the difference between an ARM embedded system where all the peripherals are part of the actual computer and it's a comprehensive system, where they expected it to be PC-like, where everything was self-describing, i.e. a PCI Express bus or a USB bus.
Yeah, and in fact, if I could say something, it's to me what's really interesting. It's not only the portability across multiple architecture that is stunning. It's also the different use cases, let's say, or workload, because we may have a tiny embedded system, not so tiny embedded system like mobiles or supercomputers, which might even be the same architecture sort of at the end, but they are very different use cases, and Linux runs on all of them, and it's all the same kernel, different configuration, sure, but it's all the same kernel.
Do we have any Linux RT people on the call?
I used to be one. They would, when I was told that what I was doing was bullshit, it was the proper sentence was real time is bullshit, and I was doing real time scheduling back then. I'm doing virtualization now, so.
No, I mean, on this very comment, I found this very interesting, because if you take a look at Linux history, the Z architecture or 390X as an S0390X support started as a hobby project in Böblingen, where some IBM engineers basically simply took the kernel and in their spare time, so the law goes anyway, see if they could make this work as I think initially as a logical partition on a mainframe system. And then marketing came along a few years later, and the rest is history, right up to Linux 1, or what is called Linux 1 these days. And so I fully concur with the fact that, yeah, let's take the ARC tree and let's see if we can get this running on our beloved particular pet hardware platform.
I think on the mainframe, took a while for marketing to take over, but one of the, what was he? principal engineer or something like that. Fairly quickly saw this Linux thing and thought that was a good idea, and gave, well, not precisely management support. He was sort of on the technical side, but he was the sort of person that no manager really wanted to pick a fight with. So effectively, the small Gallic village that tried to run Linux on the mainframe fairly early on had support, which helped a lot. And then when IBM realized how many systems they managed to sell because Linux ran on it, that also helped quite a lot.
To what extent do you think that the portability of Linux is actually attributable to Unix? Because, I mean, even Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson ported the first Unix system onto IBM mainframe. I mean, the operating system like being a really simple operating system, Unix, compared to, you know, like VMS or VM360, 370, that kind of stuff. Where the file system and everything is part and parcel of the operating system.
Well, on the devices that I did the porting, it was for the Xenodox project. We actually uploaded BusyBox via initial RAM disk over serial link, believe it or not, using a tool called Handheld Reverse Engineering Tool, which you ran on the PDA under Wince, gave it the two files, the Linux kernel and the initial RAM disk, and slowly over time I worked out how to put SSH and X11R3 into the initial RAM disk in order to get graphical things so we could actually do some exploring and actually run applications on it. And then finally we reverse engineered the NAND flash driver and were able to actually put things onto the device itself. But yeah, BusyBox was key for that. Not so much whether it was actually Linux or a POSIX subsystem itself.
No, interesting observation, and I think that makes it. This is what makes the panel pretty interesting because you all seem to come from different backgrounds.
Since I don't have interesting stories that goes that back in the past to be interesting, but I might have a question if I look at the landscape right now. Do you think is there any other space in software that might not be covered by Linux development or whatever brought to the development mentality Linux? Or is it more interesting the space which is opening, like with things like RISC-V and open software hardware, basically?
And open power. Don't forget open power.
Open power. Yeah.
Anybody still using this? Okay.
Yes, me. I'm developing an open power processor.
Okay.
That's a very good point. I think, you know, we're going to see more and more specific hardware architectures with accelerators and GPUs and stuff like that. And yes, you know, will operating systems evolve to actually provide support for this?
Well, funny thing, the Libra project which I'm heading is designed as a hybrid 3D GPU, VPU, CPU in a single processor. It's actually extending the open power instruction set.
Interesting observation there, because you clearly have the counter revolution, for want of a better expression, in the shape of Android, right? If you take a look at your typical Android spec, this is more likely than not as an ARM-compatible architecture like Snapdragon or something, with blobs put on top of this, put on top of the architecture in terms of SoC support as a system on a chip. As a system, just let me finish here. As a system on a chip, but apart from the kind of proprietary SoC implementations, this is pretty much AOSP as an Android open source project. There's not much deviation going on here. Never mind innovation. Any thoughts on this? Well, I think I have you got started, no?
If I can make an observation, and that's maybe the perspective from someone who has worked for also middle-sized business, that when you choose to make a product with something, you get the BSP, And what I've noticed is that in basically maybe the last 10 years, you get an Android BSP, which is designed to work in ways that gives you space for doing nasty things in user space and distributing binary blobs and basically making the kernel interfaces empty layers that just writes values to register. Basically, I've seen that for camera architecture. There is really weird stuff out there. And I think that one of the damages that Android made, it's giving a lot of space for doing this kind of things, which have brought many people to work with very old kernel version or very crippled kernel version. There was a statistic from Greg that says like a Qualcomm kernel is like 4 million lines of code different from the mainline one. And I think one of the important things that might happen is that give possibility to people that works with devices to work with a kernel which is close to mainline, so they can contribute back instead of being old in that very past. And I think Android has a tiny has been a force, is the driving force in that. I don't know if my perspective is correct.
Any thoughts, people?
You just reminded me. So you know, Intel sold the PXA processor to Marvel. That was the PXA series was ARM did a deal with Intel where they said, we'll give you a license for £100,000 because we're running out of money. But they promised to provide modifications to that the chip back, but when they looked at it, they found that the ARM11 was so bad that they started from scratch, and that was then sold to Marvel, who then, bless them, when they finally released the Linux kernel modifications that they've been keeping in house, it was a tarball of 7 zip files where the developers had just abandoned the previous one. They hadn't done a single commit ever in any of the things. They'd just taken whatever the latest Linux kernel tree was, and it made in-tree modifications, so no commits at all. It's just stunning. So yeah, it starts. Some of the disparate stuff of old kernels and dating it back comes down to the manufacturers of the processors not knowing what the hell they're doing, and thank goodness now Linaro started up.
But
yeah,
this
well,
wasn't.
Sorry.
But this wasn't the cause for the device tree system, was it?
No. That's another story which I looked on with dismay from having from the reverse engineering of 9 smartphones. None of them shared any hardware, and I'm looking at this thing and thinking, what the hell is going on? Everybody's loving device tree, but when you've got 100,000 peripherals, none of which are different, and you're only going to ever see one Linux kernel device driver for it, because that chip is a one-off for that product and it's going to go end of life. There's no freaking point in having a device tree.
Before we continue, maybe for the few listeners who are not familiar with Linux kernel source code contributions, maybe we should explain what a device tree system or what a device tree is. I'm more than happy to do this myself, unless there are any other volunteers. Okay, essentially it's a type of parameterization for hardware descriptions inside the kernel. As people already pointed out, Linux comes from an Intel background, but the idea is, and this is basically what was just described, with the advent of more and more SoC architectures and other stuff, the ecosystem became quite complex, let's put it this way. And the device tree was the idea to parameterize the descriptions of said devices to some extent. And this is exactly what you see basically with the I reckon with the majority of ARM architectures, smartphones, embedded systems, you name them, more often than not, these kernels would have an associated device tree explaining or defining, rather describing the hardware architecture, the hardware ecosystem running on. So meaning that you don't have to hard code these parameters into the kernel, but rather supply them as a config file, for want of a better expression. But sorry, do go ahead. Just a clarification for our listeners.
Yeah, where the assumption is that it's going to be shared across multiple devices.
Correct.
But if I mean, I don't know if you're aware of the HTC Universal was basically a micro laptop with an embedded 3G modem in it. So imagine your laptop in size, only 5 inches in size. Of course, back in 2004, that was just amazing. Nobody had anything like it. But they ran out of pins on the processor, the GPIO pins on the processor. Bear in mind, it's got 110 GPIO pins. They had to, High-Tech Corporation had to do their own custom ASIC. We called it ASIC 3. It had 64 more GPIO pins, plus some SPI and I2C and SDMMC ports and things. And they ran out of those GPIO pins and had to use the Ericsson 3G ROM communicating over the serial bus to use 16 more pins. This is a phone that had 7 speakers and audio paths. But it was a custom one-off. There's absolutely no point whatsoever in having device tree for something where there's only ever one chip, custom, unique chip across the whole thing.
Martin, you want to take the next question?
Oh, yes, sorry. So we talked about a little bit about the history, and before we move on to future of Linux, how you guys see it. Just wondering, why did you all start doing bits of kernel development, and what did you do before that? What was the motivation really behind contributing to an open source project? Who would like to go first?
I've talked quite a lot, so
it was the proverbial itch to scratch.
Okay.
I had a problem. The only decent solution for that problem was to write kernel code. So, okay, the kernel is just software. I was a student at the time. I knew how to program software. How hard could it be? Turned out to be fairly hard, but eventually you go through with it.
Excellent. And you've been doing it ever since, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that how everybody else started?
If I have to mention one motivation is that, well, whatever reason you get into that, the quantity of code which is available and the average, how deep is that? I think when you start managing all of that gets really exciting. And if you ask me why I've started, I cannot tell, probably it was a university project, but once you get that, I think I got stuck into this. It's like reading a lot of books every day, and that's, if you enjoy this kind of things, of course, it's kind of pleasure and pain, but I think the vastity of Linux is what makes it interesting. At least I mostly consider the subsystems which I'm into. I cannot tell the real core part. Maybe that's nastier, but I think that's why it's still funny for me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of the same for me, I would say. I was studying at the University Computer Engineering, but even since the beginning of studying university, maybe even before, I always wanted to write system software, let's say. And so the chance came then during the PhD of actually doing some Linux kernel development. And it's still.
Yeah, that area. Sorry, you're a little bit quiet. Could you perhaps talk a little bit louder or turn the volume up?
Yes, I'll
okay.
try to do both. Should I repeat, or did you get what
I think
said?
you're still very faint.
Yeah. Just not turn it up a notch and please repeat, yes, because I could barely understand it.
Okay, yes, I was saying that it was... Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. It was kind of the same. It is kind of the same for me than what Jaco said. The amount of stuff that it's there of very different things. The it's what keeps me still excited about doing it. I always wanted to write system software, that's what I was saying, and the chance to actually hack on the Linux kernel, it was the scheduler back then, came during the PhD, but then I still find it exciting, and I'm still there even if I changed some systems.
Okay, excellent. And I think, Orion, how did you start, and why did you start? More importantly, what was your motivation to start doing Linux?
So I have a bit of unusual path, I guess. I studied computer graphics in university, so like 3D rendering, video processing, this sort of stuff. And I couldn't find a job, and I did this Google Summer of Code thing on the Samba project.
Uh-huh.
And I did pretty well, I think. And once I was done with my studies, so my mentor, who worked at SUSE at the time, sent me an email saying, we don't have any good application this year. Would you like to apply again? So since I was finished, I was done with my studies, I couldn't apply. I wasn't a student anymore. So I said, I'm not a student anymore, but I'm looking for a job. And I couldn't find anything, computer graphics related around my area. So he said, I'll, just send your CV over and we'll take a look. And the rest is history, as they say. So I got the job at SUSE, working on SMB stuff. Mostly Samba in the beginning, since that's what I knew. But so we have a lot of bugs to work on, and eventually we had the kernel bugs related to sieves, which is the name of the module doing the kernel client for SMB. And so little by little, I started working on kernel bugs, and now that's mostly what I work on. I don't really touch the server side anymore so much. So yeah.
Interesting. With 25 to 30 years in the making, given the fact that Linux is already apparently on a planet called Mars these days, where do you see this going?
Are you asking me or?
No, I'm asking the panel in general.
Okay.
And of course, you're more than welcome to take this question.
I forgot to say the previous question.
You could just go ahead.
By all means. So, I love that you are working on the SIF stuff, Aurelian, because I was the person who did the network reverse engineering of the NT domains protocol back in '96 through to 2000.
I think your name is familiar somehow. I think.
Yeah.
You must know James McDonough.
We're talking 22 years ago now, so my memory's getting quite rusty on that one. I got into the Linux in general because of the yawning chasm between the Windows and the Unix world, and Samba was the strategic choke point for that. But after, things didn't really go well because it's quite difficult. I don't know if anybody else has done any reverse engineering of device drivers and things, reverse engineering of peripherals. But imagine that you are looking at some network traffic and you're literally just copy and pasting you implement the client and send it at the remote server. So then you get a response back and you copy that and you put that into the server, and then you get a client to talk to your server, and then you go on to the next packet. So it's a bootstrap mechanism, and you have no idea what the hell the traffic is doing. And then you present that to the rest of the team, and they ask you, okay, so now's the time for a review. What does this do? I said, I don't know. So what does this packet do? I don't know. It's reverse engineered. All I know is that after 10,000 network packets, it just works. So it didn't go down very well, and I had to leave the team. But then later, I got into reverse engineering of smartphones, Win smartphones, for exactly the same reason. that I could see that there was going to be, with the Wint smartphones, there was going to be exactly the same divide between people who had Windows CE smartphones and everything else. So, and then 2006, Android came out, so I stopped doing that.
Cool.
So just to
These days, go ahead.
Yeah, just to complete the list of how do we get into kernel hacking or kernel development. For my part, I used to work for Hewlett-Packard, a lot of test and measurement stuff, and I also tried to reverse engineer a driver for a GPIB or HPIB board from Windows NT. It was extremely difficult because it was going by a PLX, a PCI bridge, and then to an FPGA, which had to have the code loaded into it. And eventually I managed to get information from the manufacturer as to what the code is to put onto the FPGA. And once I'd got my driver working, I decided to contribute it back to the community. And that's how I ended up becoming a maintainer for the GPIB stuff. I then bought myself a USB oscilloscope, only to find that the USB TMC driver from Linux didn't support the IEEE 488.2 standard. So I implemented the missing code and contributed it back again and learned what it was to try and get past the kernel police.
That's fascinating.
That sounds, yeah.
Have you heard of Glasgow, by the way?
Yes.
Cool.
As a next question, how difficult is it to get past the kernel police? Anybody have any?
Depends on the quality of your code.
Okay.
Wow.
I wanted to answer the last question regarding how do you get into kernel development. On my case, I started using OpenSolaris back in the day, and they had very good documentation. But I have a cheap MP3 player. They have an FAT32 partition, so that I couldn't mount that partition on the OpenSolaris. So looking at the kernel, I realized that the block size was hard-coded in the kernel, so I changed that to be able to mount the device. So it was more for necessity to go into the kernel development. But after that, I went to I had a job that was more sort of a trial by fire because I have little knowledge. I was just a student, and my assignment was to port or integrate the AVI patches into the kernel that was 2.4 at that time, to be able to run COBOL, microfocus COBOL from Unix, Caldera Unix, into the Red Hat version that was 4.0. So that was a learning experience and really frustrating experience using GDB, strace, trace, just to find out which code was missing on the AVI patch to make this COBOL binary work. And those years, Linux didn't have BPF, EBPF on that time, but Solaris has the trace. So yeah, I have experience on Solaris that time and was kind of frustrated that I couldn't use the trace. And after 12 years, now we have BPF and all this observability that Solaris had on those years, but we're really good now regarding those years.
Okay, going back to my original question, people, where do you see this going? In terms of it's the biggest open source project on the planet. You have at least more than 1,000 steady contributors. There's a guy seriously affected or potentially seriously affected by the bus factor. Bus factor, of course, being if Linux is run over by a bus. Of course, there are kernel source code maintainers, but ultimately he calls the shots, if I'm not completely mistaken, what goes into a kernel and what doesn't. Needless to say, he's very outspoken about certain quality issues, but that would be my next question. But let's focus on where do you see this going first? Anything goes.
That's the $1,000,000 question, I guess.
Well, I think there's a desire to start cleaning the kernel, get rid of the crafty stuff. We talked about setfs, getfs going, sort of hangover from the 286, 386 days. They've just dumped a whole bunch of WiMAX code because there aren't very many WiMAX users. In fact, there are none. So I think, where's this going to go? We're going to need to do a lot of cleanup in order to, get Linux or keep Linux as agile to adapt to new environments as it has been.
I think that more than a technical issue, that there might be many, and I think also the push for removing old architectures, it's maybe due to that. It's how well that this thing will continue to scale, because in the last year there's been several talks and presentations about how maintainers doesn't scale, an example, and the number of contributors keeps growing, but some subsystems are really there is people which is bottleneck, and that's not their fault. It's just the structure which is not scaling fast enough, probably. And now to make it scale in a way which is consistent for such things like it's what remains of a community, because it's huge and it's very hard to keep it together somehow. How to scale and how to multiply the responsibilities, which means not only maintaining code but testing also, and also how to make that. I think we're past the professionalism time where it's harder to contribute to the kernel as a single individual. So most maintainers now have a paycheck for someone which has a lot of power in Linux to take decisions. And also, I think scaling in a way which is not letting grow organically. It's a key to keep the community functioning and be less independent and in respect to some pushes that have been in the last years, probably. And that's, of course, has technical repercussion, like what you said, removing older architecture. Nobody maintains that. There might be users, but maintaining an architecture, it's a lot of job. And now it's probably harder than 20 years ago.
Yeah. The Linux doesn't scale thread started, I think, in 2001. So scalability issues are nothing new. And in spite of the doom and gloom in 2001, we survived and we're still around. So I'm not that skeptical.
So does anybody remember the Cambridge Linux meeting where Linus asked all of the kernel maintainers, the heads of the kernel maintainers, to turn up? And there were 36 people at the meeting. 18 of them were ARM people, and Linus said, "What are you all doing here, you ARM people? Go away and come back when there's only one representative for the whole of ARM." And it's like, oh, for God's sake. It's not recognizing that, at the time there were 1,000 licensees for the ARM architecture. They're all different. They happen to use the same instruction set, or actually they don't, because you've got ARM 7, 9, 11, the weird Broadcom version, ARM 11 with a hard float thing, and then you've got the Cortex ones. They're all completely different. And very sadly, Russell King, is Russell still around as the ARM maintainer?
He's still around. Whether he's still around as the ARM maintainer, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, because when we submitted, our team submitted the patches upstream, we divided down into separate files in a subtree below the main ARM thing. This was when there were only 200 files or 100 files in the ARM kernel device tree directory. Russell asked us to submit it under the current structure, which to put everything in a flat in one directory. And I was so embarrassed by this because it would have dropped 250, because we have the 9 smartphones that we've been reverse engineering. It would have dropped 250 files into that directory and completely overwhelmed it. And we were so embarrassed that we just didn't submit it. We didn't take it further because I didn't want to embarrass or overload Russell.
And that I think connect with the fact that for the perspective of being relatively new to the thing and looking at a bit from the external, as I feel myself, and still wondering what am I doing here. I think all the story about people which is very close to Linus and that direct interfacing with Linus worked when the system was probably smaller, and now you have people which is indeed core maintainers and core developer of Linux, which has direct access to the maintainers meeting. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done inside the subsystem, and there has been a push with the subsystem maintainers book, share maintainership like DRM KMS is doing. So I'm not concerned about the fact that core developer could scale and access to Linux and a functioning way of keeping it going. I'm more concerned about the fact that a lot of people has a lot of responsibilities, and that it's bad for their health in some time because there is people which is very overwhelmed, and also it maybe hinders a bit the contribution rate of some part of the kernel, or make it less reliable in testing, or blah blah blah. And I think growing the number of contributors, but also people which have smaller responsibility, is a key for scaling in a way which is sustainable. And maybe you see that happen, so you're not concerned.
I think a problem there is always code review in a way.
Absolutely.
You have way more people that have written some code and send it upstream, wherever upstream is. And now upstream, you have far fewer people that get to take a look at that code, decide to merge it, or more likely decide to say, you could have done this a little bit differently. And review is not that much less work than writing the code in the first place. Depending on the quality of the code, it may actually be more work. So you tend to have reviewers that are overwhelmed, or then from the contributor point of view, review is not happening, or it's not happening fast enough, and I'm sending my patches and get no response. And getting people to actually send good patches where the review is very simple, and eventually you build up trust, and this comes from Jens Axbo, I will merge it because everything has been fine most of the time, and if it isn't, I complain loudly once and he will learn. Getting these people is important, but you get obviously far more people that do one kernel patch in their lifetime and never come back, or do a few things, or just don't have the quality, or don't have the time they are willing to commit. And the bottleneck tends to be on the one rung up, the people that are reviewing code, the maintainers, and they can spend 90 hours a week and still not get done. So there's an issue.
And I think this will very well connect with the previous question. How hard is to get past the kernel police? I think the real question is how hard is get to be the kernel police look at you, and sometimes for contribution, because there is a shortage of people doing reviews, and that plays a role. Something like I think still the imposter syndrome. Sometimes it's happened at the very beginning when you start contributing. You look at patches and say, "Yeah, it's okay for me, but who am I to send a reviewed by tag?" Which is instead very helpful for the community to know that someone will look into that, and maybe. And there's been a discussion recently, I guess, if it's not worth to make it the review tags richer, like saying, yeah, I look at this part, I have no really idea what this part does, but that part, I look into that and it seems fine to me. And that might make it easier for people to feel like not embarrassed to say, yes, I've reviewed that. I take the authority to say I've reviewed that, which I think plays a role in the fact that people maybe read code, but doesn't really feel like saying that that's okay for me. I take responsibility to say so, because who am I to say so?
Is there a particular reason why something like Gerrit is not being used? I mean, is it just the sheer size that the whole thing would fall over or require a massive supercomputer to run?
You mean Gerrit, the code review system?
The patch review system, yeah.
I think because that's opened a never-ending discussion about why people would never give up email patch review by email, and I'm totally for
I do love that.
I do love that, absolutely. But we've seen several times. We've seen some system moving to GitLab.
uses. Look at the email reviewing. I have used Garrett for other projects. Illumos is using Garrett now. FreeSPD is using Fabricator, and OpenBSD just send the patches to the tech list and you're done. But yeah, I mostly think that the current way of doing things today is fine. Maybe I'm just used to it, but I have used all the systems that for those kernels, and I think the review by email is pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with you, Carlos. And the other thing is that, there are so many trees that different patches are going to go into, depending on what area you're submitting a patch on. It's not like your patches are going into one place. They'll go into sort of, USB next, and then into USB, and then into Linux next, and then into Linus's tree. So, automated code review system is not going to be able to deal with the diversity of trees and which tree feeds which other tree, subject to which conditions, etc., etc.
It would fall over and require a supercomputer to run. Yeah.
Well, if nothing else, if you wanted to make changes, you have to acknowledge that it's distributed, and you need the ability to make local changes while still being compatible with the interfaces to the unchanged part of the infrastructure. So basically, feel free to use Gerrit in your subsystem, but then send patches via email or whatever, or send pull requests to the next rung up in the tree structure.
Guys, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, if Gerrit ends up being a good thing and everyone is just raving about it, it will spread. And if people don't like it that much, it will not spread. It's very organic.
Well, that's the usual evolution called the survival of the fittest, right? Which you, by the way, see outside the kernel ecosystem as well. Changing tack a little bit. Not too sure how many of you have followed the last year's Linux Plumber conference, because something very interesting happened there. A few people made a proposal to introduce a second programming language in the kernel called Rust. Now, when I reviewed the slides of the presentation, I came across a remark from Linus himself saying that, and I'm oversimplifying things, but entering C++ won't happen. Let's put it this way. There's a very interesting mail on the Linux kernel mailing list outlining the rationale behind this, and as usual, Linus was quite explicit on this. But Linus actually blessed subsequently the potential use of Rust in the kernel as a safe alternative, let's put it this way, to C. So given the fact that this is a major change, or can be a major change, let's put it this way, after about almost 30 years of programming in C, what are your views on the introduction of this new programming language, given the fact that this is mostly aimed at the moment, if I understand this correctly, at Java development and not kind of instrumental subsystems like schedulers and so forth?
I think it's an interesting attempt, but it's still at a toy state, I think, at this point. There's so many stuff needed to make it work that I mean, it's unlikely to see anything interesting until, for the at least 2 or 3 years. I don't know.
Couldn't concur more. At the moment, it only runs on 64-bit Intel architectures. You need a special C-lang version for this. You need a nightly installation of the Rust compiler. And a few other bits, let's put it this way.
Yeah, always going to need a nightly version of the Rust compiler.
But I consider this to be the first step, as you rightly said, and given the fact that it took almost 30 years, because until now, pretty much, the kernel has been done in assembler and C, and that's where it stops. I think that's an interesting development, let's put it this way. Especially given the traits that Rust has in comparison to plain C.
I think it's surprising how Linus was convinced to merge this. I didn't expect it to go that smoothly.
Well, yeah, me too, at least to a certain extent. Then the entirely personal opinion that I've grown about this is that, at some point, how to say, kind of a lot of people are pushing, not necessarily from inside the kernel community, but even outside, and what happens outside in, I don't know, matters to a certain extent. We saw multiple examples of that. So I grow the opinion that since there is a lot of attention of this, there is a lot of pushing this, then at some point, probably fighting too hard against something like this would just have been not only perceived as bad, but also required a lot of effort, while letting it in this way and waiting for seeing whether people will ever be able to do anything useful with it, which perhaps yes, but perhaps no, was the least resistant path. Maybe.
I agree.
I don't buy that at all. That's not how Linus thinks. If he thinks that the code is crap or the design is ugly or use any other curse words, he will say so very publicly. And if half the kernel community disagrees with him, but he still believes that he's right, he will not back down. So this is not based on popular opinion. This is Linus is at least somewhat intrigued by what Rust offers.
Memory security and the set type safety and things, yeah.
Whether he's entirely convinced, I'm not sure, but he's at least intrigued.
Yeah, I think it's strange because, he's been very adamant about how he dislikes C++. Because it's very complex and other things. But Rust is also very complex, I think, compared to the simplicity of C. It's not that easy. Like there's a book to as an exercise to. So the book is about implementing linked list. It's a whole book dedicated to different ways of implementing linked list in Rust, because it's not that straightforward actually to do it properly, with the language. So yeah, it's really surprising, I think, for me.
Well, that's precisely the reason why there's a component in the standard library coming with Rust to implement linked lists. But I get your point. The thing is the learning curve, and I've mastered that myself a few years back, and I wouldn't consider myself a Rust expert by no means, is quite steep. Full disclosure, C was the third language I learned, even before starting university. And C has basically been following me, let's put it this way, for better expression, and so I'm not saying hunting me, but C has been basically with me for the better part rather of my professional life, and I still regard this as one of the, well, let's put it this way, not complicated languages, but you see, Rust has one big advantage. If you convince the Rust compiler to generate code for you, you're rather there. In terms of, there's not much left in terms of final QA of the code. Whereas in C, once you kind of convince the compiler to generate code, then the real fun starts. And given the fact that I'm talking to kernel developers, I don't have to explain what an oops is. So this is my take on the situation.
I agree with you, but at the same time, C++ also had some arguments, some ways to do compile checks and things like this. Not as advanced as Rust, but still had some features for that. And Linus thought it was too complex, where he couldn't. I remember one of his arguments was when you write C, you know that a few lines you write, you have an idea of how they would compile to. You have an idea of the instruction getting generated and such. And for Rust, it's like C++. You don't really know. One line could generate a lot of things. You have not really. There's no guarantee on that. So I think it's a very complex language.
Yeah, but I think that is really more complex than Rust, because
when you get into operator overloading, I've known of people who, why is my code running slow? It's in C++. It's because they did so many operator overloads, and somebody helped them single step through it, and they were horrified at what they produced.
I think it's Rust allowed in the kernel, and that produces more people that could contribute, or maybe more drivers. I think that is a win-win situation for all. Means more drivers, maybe more laptops are supported, and more devices are supported. I think Rust is a good language. I learned first C, then Lisp, then C++, then Go, then and learning Rust. I think it's a good language. It's obviously more complex than C, but I think choosing between C++ and Rust, I choose Rust.
I think one of the beauties of C is actually if you're using it long enough, you pretty much have a good idea of what the assembly looks like once you code in a statement in C. That is not the case, as you just said, with C++. Rust, I think it's halfway in between. Let's put it this way.
Complex or not complex, I think the safety argument could make the real difference compared to C++, because they might be more or less complex one of each other, but one guarantees you safety for most of the meaning that you can assign to safety. The other one doesn't guarantee you that. So
I mean, you just so that's a win.
Absolutely.
Exactly. You just have to take a look at the ownership concept, for example, in Rust. And I think with regards to technical depth, and these metrics, I would reckon, come into play a certain role here, because essentially you're talking about how many million lines of code these days? The kernel itself, about 2 million or something.
20 million last time I checked, but it's been a while.
Okay, so I reckon it hasn't. Well, the last couple of releases have seen a certain vanishing of subsystems, but I reckon it's fair to say it's still a complex beast. And factors or metrics like technical depth, and especially if you refactor portions of such a large, significant code base, then any little tiny help you can get from a development ecosystem like Rust and Cargo and all the rest of it, I reckon do factor in big time.
Right. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Cargo there. That's one of my biggest concerns, is that whatever is behind Cargo gets hacked. When I did a very comprehensive review of the requirements for secure code distribution, it took about a month, and I came up with 17 separate and distinct requirements to do the full chain of trust. And it is concerning me that Rust developers are heavily reliant on Cargo, which downloads code from completely random locations that they've never even checked.
Well, crates.io would be your go-to resource. It needs to say you can reconfigure this.
Yeah, but what if crates.io gets hacked? This happened with or some location gets replaced. Like Arch Linux had a package that was replaced by a GitHub user. A developer had closed their account. A hacker had registered that exact same username and created the exact same package and managed to get a Trojan uploaded into Arch Linux. So yeah.
That is, of course, the danger with centralized package distribution infrastructures, but at the same time, it has happened to PyPy, and I think it took about 7 hours for these, I don't know how many pairs of eyes, to spot this and to eliminate this. Granted,
it wouldn't happen with Debian because they use a chain of trust to do GPG signing of the things. It would never happen with Debian.
Well, feel free to submit a pull request for Cargo or for Crates.io here. No jokes aside, I hear you. Absolutely.
Debian has had other security nightmares that shall not be named, so I wouldn't hold up Debian as a shining example.
Okay, guys. Okay, final question, I reckon, because we have to close the show at some stage. Linus itself. Linus, of course, is a bit of a colorful character. Let's put it this way. And especially if you take a look at something called the Linux kernel mailing list, you'll see quite a few rants. You'll see quite a few examples of very strong language. Let's put it this way. There was this hiatus thing where he went actually out of, I wouldn't say out of business, but what's the word I'm looking for? Into a temporary retirement, let's put it this way. I think a few years back, came back. There were rumors on the street that actually he went into therapy. He admittingly did say about himself that he's coming from a dysfunctional background, but then he sees nothing wrong with being abrasive, outspoken, never mind insulting it at times. What is your view on this?
If I may. So, has anybody seen Mythbusters? Is anybody else a fan of Mythbusters? I love it. I watch every 8 months. I would watch all 250 episodes of a period on a cycle. And one of the episodes, they had, what is the effect of swearing on pain? Because, if somebody hurts themselves, they swear, right? So they studied, did a scientific controlled study of whether if you swore with where your hand was in an ice bucket, which is a known way to induce pain, whether you will be able to tolerate pain more if you were swearing. And it turned out that you can. And I think so people are misunderstanding why people are swearing on the mailing list. It's because they are relieving stress. And that's, to be intolerant of people because they are doing so is completely misunderstanding the neurophysiological effects of the extraordinarily complex job that they're doing.
I fully appreciate that concern. On the other side, there are basic social protocols which you violate when you become that abrasive, that insulting, because that's normally not how societies work.
Yeah. Isn't there a bit of responsibilities around that, about all the constant chatting that happens around? All Linus has called this guy on the mailing list, and you go there's Phoronix, and he gives the middle finger to someone. Isn't that a bit responsibility a bit too much gossip around that? Well, what we care is actually technical work.
Needless to say, I am trying to play devil's advocate here.
Yeah, but not. I mean, in general, not in the specific. I mean, in general, about the Linux characterization of that. There's the background, the feelings, and that opens a totally different argument than the characterization of people.
There were quite a few developers who left the ecosystem because of his behavior, if memory serves correct.
True.
On the other side, you also have developers that have left or not joined various GNU projects because, quite frankly, the culture doesn't fit. And
absolutely.
Without taking sides, you have a certain culture in a certain project, and if you are okay with that culture, feel free to join that project, contribute, have fun. If you don't like that culture, go find a different project.
If I can give one perspective of that, I'm sorry, but I've been talking about it with a friend a few days ago, so I'm sorry to interrupt you. But I understand what you say, but he told me you have to consider people like in different cultures. When being scolded in public, it's like public humiliation. And so you have a developer from a culture where that perceived being scolded in public or being insulted in a way which is not offending for me. Something like that ends his career.
Especially in Japan or
exactly. I was
Asia,
thinking about Asia.
There were similar issues in the airline industries where exactly those different cultures where saving face was a big thing had airplanes crash because the co-pilot said things like, "Ooh, the weather looks bad," which would, in other cultures, in Linus' culture, would have been translated to, "You're flying into a storm and you're going to kill us all." But because culturally it was not acceptable to be so frank, the co-pilot tried to warn the pilot in also many words, and the pilot didn't get it, and the plane crashed and 200 people died. And there were, I think, multiple instances of that. So now it may be bad for your career, but it also has consequences to be more polite. And in the airline industry, people actively went to a more confrontational, it's spade as it's spade culture. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's harder to say for the kernel, but somebody else's career may not be the most important thing in the world. Somebody else's life might be more important. The quality of the product might be more important.
I do feel you're right. It is important to recognize the responsibility of getting things wrong, especially with Linux now being used in embedded systems, mission-critical systems.
It's also true that
I get being frank, but insulting is really crossing the line. I think you don't have, especially when you're communicating by text. You don't have, there's no need to insult. I think.
So to oversimplify things, the more you swear, the better the code gets. Especially in embedded systems.
Less plane crashes. The more you swear, less plane crashes. I like that.
I'm just oversimplifying things here.
I think it is really important to understand that when somebody is shouting like that they are releasing stress, and that it's a way of coping for them.
Which is all fair and square, don't get me wrong. Yes, I fully see that angle.
I mean, I get this when it's happening in, like, when you're talking with your voice, but when you're typing, I don't buy it. I don't think this releases any stress by typing insults, especially after the fact. I don't know.
Maybe Linus has a voice-to-speech system. It does review like that.
I've done it. I've done it many times.
Really?
I reckon, I mean, he's not the only one, right? Maybe he's the worst, but quite a few people are pretty outspoken. Whenever full disclosure, I don't read the LKM regularly, but every now and then I do take a look, and quite a few people, quite a few contributors don't beat around the bush, let's put it this way, especially when they have a concerned voice. Okay. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I think that one was quite an interesting, thorny topic. I do wish, I would like to see that there was a how can I put it, a conflict resolution series of procedures that people were felt safe to call on in free software projects, that everybody was happy to use.
Maybe through a more democratic process, voting or something. I don't know.
The one I mentioned this, I did it with JT on the open source voices one. There's a website called crnhq.org, which has some conflict resolution things. And there's also the ALDI Institute, the guy from MASH, who helps people scientists to communicate. And these procedures, by the processes, that's by CRNHQ, anybody can read them. They don't need voting. It's about empathy, and people acting in a role of mediator, should they choose to do so, to listen to what the other person is saying. I think it's a very interesting thing. And I do wish that more free software projects actually use this, including
But I think for Linus's case, I mean, he's a personality that we've lived with for a very long time. I mean, he's not surprising the way he is, and he has a model of the benevolent dictator, and he's not going to show empathy with something he thinks is a bad idea ever. So you just got to live with it, or just, find another project. That's my opinion.
How do you, sorry to ask you a question, though, I appreciate we want to wrap up, but how do you square that when you see it as a duty or a responsibility to fix something?
Fix as in you have a bug in your code, or fix as in you have a bug in your culture?
A bug in culture, or a systemic problem. That I think, for example, with the whole reason why I got into Samba was to fix the yawning chasm between the Windows world and the Unix and Linux worlds, where people would get trapped running Windows and couldn't convert over to running on a Unix system, a Unix file system.
Well, if you follow the discussion about the introduction of CFCR, I think was mostly about that, moving from a code of conflict like the Linux kernel had to a code of conduct, which is punitive, and the other implications. I think it's part of this process between trying to adapt the culture to be, which not being insulting doesn't mean accepting bad code, but sometimes also saying like, no, this is wrong, asking why did you do that? It in reviews makes a difference, and maybe people is sensitive, I know, and sometimes you have to the feeling that people take things too seriously, probably. But I think when the introduction of code of conduct and removal of code of conflict, or all the debate that arose around the proposal communication standards and blah, 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 it's part of this kind of evolution and the empathy that you've been talking about, probably.
Okay,
because we had a code of conflict, and I mean, the rules were already there, but they were not enforced, like you have not to do this, and that. And that was not enough. So probably shows that something was not totally okay with that.
A topic for another time, that one. It's a whole episode on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that. It's not the right answer for the last question of the show.
Yes, there will be a continuation of this episode. You will get the invitation mail. No worries. Okay, Martin, you would like to do the honor to wrap this up?
Yeah, I'd just like to say great contributions from everybody, and a great bunch of experience that you all have in developing Linux, and obviously there's many systems relying on your contributions. So great job, everyone, and thank you from myself, and likewise from Chris, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you very much for participating, and thanks again for participating.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was a very eclectic discussion, don't you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great insight into the into the biggest and longest running, not entirely sure, probably longest running open source project, right? So great.
Is there the other one running longer? I can't remember.
It seems
of course, Emacs. Never mind VI.
Yes, our favorite editor. Excellent.
Indeed. What I found particularly interesting was the discussion at the very end about swearing and lowering pain levels and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I agree that's a bit of a common theme amongst, especially for people who are considering contributing, considering patches, right, on any project. What are the levels of you have to, or the hurdles you have to overcome to do this, and why would you do one if you're just going to be shouted at? To put it simply, But then only on the flip side, you have the case of a recent episode, which is yet to be released, where your code is public, and by the way, this is a Rust episode coming up. Your code is public, and people will dig into it, and people will find holes in it. Therefore, which is the great thing about open source, really. So
holes in Rust, okay?
Not in Rust itself, but in the application of it.
I see.
So,
I mean, this is the usual dilemma, right? Because as the discussion turns out, yes, there may be indications of swearing lowering pain levels. I get it. But on the other side, that violates basic social protocols. So you're walking a fine line between lowering your pain level and pissing off contributors, as in fellow contributors. And that's exactly what happened, because quite a few people actually left the project.
Right.
There was some Intel girl lady, details will be in the show notes, of course, who left for that very reason. And I can at least recall one subsystem maintainer defecting for the same reason, because he was simply not having it with regards to the behavior of certain benevolent dictators for life, as the BDFLs of the project.
Well, as you put it, it's a certain social protocol, isn't it?
I mean, just take a look at a self-confessed artist called Richard M. Stallman.
Yeah, it's if people choose to break those protocols, then they do so for a reason, and as you say, maybe for their own reasons, but. Then from the contributor side, you have to consider, is it worth this? I mean, okay, you may not agree with it, but what are you trying to achieve with your contribution, right? So that is maybe the main thing that is important here, rather than, whichever way people communicate.
Yeah.
You have to be beyond that, right?
I mean, this is the reason why I suppose that many projects now, and you'll see this happening with events as well, now have something called the Code of Conduct, which explicitly outrules such behavior.
Right. No, that's very sensible. Yeah. And I think someone made the point about the fact that it's done via email, right? So if you swear in a moment when something happens and it's a reaction to a certain event or a pain or whatever it is, then that makes sense. But if you're doing an email, it's a thought process that you can easily reconsider or not apply. Let's put it that way.
Plus the fact that for example, the Linux kernel mailing list gets archived, so your rants, your swearings, your outbursts are there for eternity for everybody to read. Not great.
No, I agree with that. Yeah. So but I think we had a number of people who, we had people in both camps, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, and most of them, the panel have been contributing for many years, right? Apart from a few relatively new guys, as in 5 years, I think, something like that. But all the others have been doing it for many years, so they obviously, as I said, see beyond that or put up with it or whatever you want to call it. They're there for a bigger project, right?
Maybe they're just born to suffer. No, I'm joking. People, this is not how I see things. No, actually, I see both sides, but I think society, and this is a broader philosophical statement now, society has got to the states where it's in, and of course that is a subject for debate for another whole different show, not by swearing, but rather by cooperating and facilitating and stuff. And basic social protocols played a very important part in this.
Indeed.
And with that, I think we are at the very end, right? Or any final passing remarks?
Well, the final passing remarks, apart from that last topic, I found it, interesting to meet people that have been contributing at that kind of level since the year 0, pretty much, isn't it? That's pretty impressive.
And that brings us to the end of said show, Season 1, Episode 29, the Big Kernel panel. And see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This is the Linux Inlaws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, type Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for their song Solid Market, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under CC at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts.
You've been listening to Hacker Public Radio at hackerpublicradio.org. We are a community podcast network that releases shows every weekday, Monday through Friday. Today's show, like all our shows, was contributed by an HPR listener like yourself. If you ever thought of recording a podcast, then click on our contribute link to find out how easy it really is. Hacker Public Radio was founded by the Digital Dog Pound and the Infonomicon Computer Club and is part of the binary revolution at binrev.com. If you have comments on today's show, please email the host directly, leave a comment on the website, or record a follow-up episode yourself. Unless otherwise stated, today's show is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 license.